So the history of colony in Africa, as I said, Africa was the last continent to be colonized by European. It was not under their radar. They didn't see any interest. They didn't find any interest in Africa. They didn't know about natural resources. They were focused on other parts of the world. They started from seaports, and later on, at the end of 1800, when they figured they were aware about the natural resources available in Africa, they just started moving in. Now, what they did, 5 countries, they started taking possession of Africa. Because they didn't want to get into war or conflict with each other, those European countries, in Berlin conference, they had a Berlin conference, and they started dividing Africa equally among themselves. Now, although the treaty with Portuguese started 1500, but it was not of their interest. Colonization took place in 2 separate periods. First period was 19th century, 1800. British and French took possession of Northern Africa, which, as I said, Egypt was British colony, and then Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and where's the other one? Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, I guess that's it. They are French colonies. Suez Canal was a very important phenomenon for British because it was a connection among Africa and the rest of the world, which was through Egypt. Through owning Egypt, British were able to also acquire Sudan because Sudan was south of Egypt. So they had to go through Egypt and then towards south through Sudan. The second wave of colonization in Africa began 1880s when Europeans discovered the value of Africa that Africa had to offer. Belgians discovered copper in Congo. That's the history of Congo, and then that's how they went to Congo, and the one that I was showing you guys, Patrice Lumumba, is from Congo. Largest copper producing area in the world. British discovered diamonds and gold in South Africa. European countries agreed at the Berlin Conference of 1885 to divide up Africa. 5 of them, they started dividing the entire Africa. That's how they divided. United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium. Italy had a very, very small part here. Italy had a very small part, so it was never part of it really because it was a very small portion and a small time. So the other 5, United Kingdom, France, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium were actually the colonies. And Spain actually had a very small role in Africa, but the major ones were France, Belgium, and British in Africa. Now, these are the consequences of British rule in Africa. Unfortunately, you will see a lot of problems, as I said, because they divided the tribes in a manner that they didn't work with each other very well. These are the consequences of the colonialism. When Europeans took over Africa and divided the region, they paid least attention to the demographics of the region, as I said. So they didn't have the same backgrounds, they didn't have the same culture, they didn't have the same language, and historically for 3,000 years, they were in war with each other. Now that they were a country, they had to work with each other. So that was one of the biggest problems that happened after post-colonialism. Tribes had problems with each other for centuries, founded, lumped together in the same colonies. Burundi and Rwanda is the case in point that I said, Hutus and Tutsis. The population growth led to migration to big cities. In big cities, local people were treated inferior. Now, what happened was that because of sanitations that Europeans brought with themselves to Africa, actually the death rate started slowing down a little bit. And we're talking about 100, 150 years ago. The death rate started slowing down. So population growth was more visible. Now, people didn't have any opportunity in rural areas. They started moving because it was all agriculture. But when colonies took over, they started forming cities, larger cities, so they could live in those cities. People started moving to cities as well to work for them. But what happened was that they were treated inferior to those Europeans. products were bought cheap, as we said, from local people and processed and sold very expensive to them. The chief of the tribe, as I said, would basically control the tribe and take more money. And that's how the corruption ideology started. And when you always talk to African dictators or African government, they'll always tell you that, oh, Africa is not ready for democracy. We're still not ready for democracy. So meaning like I have to rule them until they become ready for democracy. I don't know what they mean exactly. But that's what they say still today. Now the other one that, for example, each country has its own history with violence and it's amazing. Sierra Leone, for example, in 2000, between 2005 to 2008, early 2000, they were, I don't know if I told you guys that the two tribes, when they were fighting with each other, one tribe took over the government. So now that they're taking over the government, they're actually, they had to do, chop off the hands. So there is a huge camp in Sierra Leone, that has men and boys that don't have hands. So the camp is right now working. They're trying to really help those people right now. United Nations went there and the government of Sierra Leone changed and they're trying to help them. But there is a huge actually population of male that don't have hands. That was basically their idea of chopping hands so they can basically kill the ideology of the other tribe so they can never take over anymore. And this is very recent, it's 10 years ago. And I had this one because, I'm sorry?
Why little boys? Why boys?
Because the ideology when it says so they cannot, you're basically stripping them from having the power later, right? Those boys are going to grow up and do something. So when you do that, they will never have the power.
They train them young too.
They always do training, but their own tribes. Yeah, they have a lot of tribes.
Like
soldiers.
yeah, like they're running around with guns and stuff.
But that's in Latin America too. You see a lot of that in Latin America too. Post-colonial issues, Africans had no experience with self-government. Leadership often involved being connected with the right tribe. So as I said, the bribery, like corruption. As in the days of the tribe's chief, strongman rule developed, corruption on a grand scale started, bureaucracies expanded to provide jobs for the supporters of the leader, who usually was a military officer. So all of these were a very good base for corruption that we see today, fundamental corruption. Most foreign aid would end up in the hands of the rulers. So foreign aid would go there, but it was never distributed to the population as it was intended. So the ruler would take over. Mobutu Sese Seko, president of Zaire, which is currently Democratic Republic of Congo, but it used to be Zaire, from 1965 to 1997 had deposited billions of dollars in Swiss banks. And Swiss banks actually are very famous for African leaders and Middle Eastern dictators too, to have to deposit their money in Swiss banks. Zaire achieved its independence in 1960. It had 88 miles of usable roads. By 1985, this was down to 12,000 miles. When you're independent, you expect to grow the country, right? It was down. Even usable roads were down from 88,000 miles to 12,000. So it's a lot of downgrade for in the country after the independence. Instead of like you show more improvement and development, they were exactly opposite. Zaire was a country that I think you guys know the history of it by Muhammad Ali Clay, the boxer. So he refused to be drafted to Vietnam War, right? So he was arrested a couple times, and because of that, he was not allowed to play in the United States. So he goes to Zaire and he plays over there. That's what Zaire was in the 70s, it wasn't on the map. Income inequality, I just wanted to show you guys, interestingly enough, the widest gap using Gini coefficient was not focused only on African countries. Look at here, so these are Africa. Lesotho, South Africa, this is Oceania, Haiti, here again in Caribbean, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, Comoros, Hong Kong. That was very interesting to me, that Hong Kong was on the top of the list, and Guatemala. Yeah, it's expected. Most of them are Africa still, but Hong Kong was one of the very interesting ones. Now the reason that was, if you see Hong Kong there, the reason that you see Hong Kong there is because they have very rich people. When you calculate the very rich and the poor that they have, it shows a huge gap. Richest people in the world, a lot of them live in Hong Kong. You don't need to pay taxes, it's free market, you can do whatever you want. Population dynamics. This is basically highest population growth in the world is mostly focused in Africa. Again, the growth, just wait when I'm finished and then I'll ask. Population growth, you see, with the exception of Iraq. Again, as I said, you can have a seat. South Sudan, 3.83%. And look, Angola, Malawi, Burundi, Uganda, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Zambia, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Benin, Western Sahara, Togo, Guinea, Cameroon, only Iraq, Madagascar, and Liberia. These are all African countries, but except Iraq. Now, if you look into the United States, we have population growth, I think, 0.7. And most countries, developed countries, have like 0 point or 1 point, very, very small growth rate. And then a lot of other ones have negative growth rates, so they don't have a growth rate. Japan, Germany, those are all suffering from negative growth rate. Now, political and social instability, as we said, because they put those tribes together, it was a base and foundation for civil war, right? So therefore, you would see constantly civil war, probably you've heard, civil war within the African tribes because of the mapping that colonies did. 2010, these are all different countries, Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, Nigerian coup d'etat, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egyptian, Guinea-Bissau, again, this was an attempt. And Niger attempt, Ivory Coast, Malawi, constitutional crisis, and Malian coup d'etat. And 22 more coup d'etat in Africa within the last couple years, only last couple years. So, as I said, think about this, for 200 years, all of these was going on, the problems, and then at the end, mapping that they put the tribes that never got along together, they put them together, and they called them a country. Now, these countries are independent only for less than half a century, so which is very, very recent. Therefore, the problem still is there until they can get used to working a little with each other. And unfortunately, the corruption is within the roots of African nations, and that's also because of the colony too. Why? Because they started training them to become corrupt. So we'll pay you, and as you see, it says, if you're the bigger boy, like if you have power or you're the chief of the tribe, you get paid, and so you can control your tribe. These are the natural resources in Africa. I showed you guys how many natural resources. We went over this one. I'm sorry?
One of the main natural resources, like from what I heard from my country in Nigeria, like 87% of the revenue they bring in is caused by the petroleum industry.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
The problem is that when you have a lot of natural resources, it doesn't offer a lot of other opportunities to diversify your industries. Which if at one point, for example, there is no need for natural resources, let's say petroleum, the whole country can collapse if there is an alternative energy. But the continent is full of natural resources, but again, that also could be a negative aspect because the country is not focusing on diversifying industries, on manufacturing, for example, developing something, yes.
One of my other classes, like for political science, first and third world changes, one of the main things that we went over that although having like a lot of natural resources may be like a good thing, one of them, it does have like a lot of its drawbacks. Like countries that are rich like in natural resources are more like likely to experience something like some other country coming in here.
No, of course.
Asian,
Exactly, of course.
Definitely one, yeah.
I mean, it's good, but it's bad in fact too, because if you see most countries with natural resources, they have always been the subject of colonies, colonization, or the subject of invasion, or anything throughout the history. Look at Middle East and Africa, they have always been the subject of invasion or taking over just because of their natural resources. And we have Venezuela here, and because they want to stay independent, so that's another problem too. But yeah, absolutely, it has its own positive and negative points too. Foreign trade and investment in Africa, this is current after post-colonies. Largest investors in Africa are United States, United Kingdom, France, and China. Currently, you can say China is passing all of them and taking over. Literally, it was an article by South African University that says China is being taken over entire Africa. The entire African continent is being owned by Chinese investors. So from the railroads, from airports, infrastructures, ports, everything, they're trying to basically build. And they say, well, this conference, actually, in this conference, this university professors of South Africa, they're asking Chinese president that if you can basically, if you guys are going to be colonizing us again, the same thing that was in the past. So he basically responds, no, we don't, because we have a history of being superpower in the world for thousands of years, and we never did that. So you can look at our history and see that we wouldn't be doing that. And when we come here, we actually hire local people here, which they did. They went there, they hired local people. Unfortunately, because they couldn't find enough skillful laborers in Africa, they had to replace them again with their own employees. So they brought their own employees back again to Africa. This is AIDS. AIDS is a major problem in Africa. This is AIDS adult prevalence rate compares the percentage of adults ages between 15 to 20 and 49 living with HIV and AIDS. And look, this is only 15 to 49. There are actually a lot living with after 49 years old. Look at the rate, 27%, almost 1/3 of the population. That's huge, 1/3 of the population. Lesotho, 25% with Botswana, South Africa. Now, I was in South Africa myself, but I'm going to give you guys my experience later after you cover Nigeria. South Africa, we were told to be very, very careful too, because literally the entire country, they were telling us that it is suffering from AIDS. And it's a lot of shelters and centers that they support kids who are born with AIDS because the mother had AIDS. So the issue is huge, beyond believable when you go there and see them physically. But HIV and AIDS is a huge factor in Africa too.
Why isn't still that the case if it's been around for so many years? And I mean,
I will they told us exactly why it is. In South African culture, this is a tribal culture, and that's what we were told, because one of the students asked exactly the same question. In South African culture, our guide told us that male sperm is basically holy, so they shouldn't be wasting. If there is an urge, they had to, whoever is there, they had to, I don't know, rape or whatever. Literally on the street.
they don't believe in masturbation.
It's not.
I mean, we're serious.
That's what South Africa was. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's what I was told by a local person in Africa. I haven't heard from anyone. I haven't read it. The person told us, be careful. We were not allowed to go on the street by ourselves. We had to be in a group of 4 or 5, or with male, with our other colleagues. One night, I remember we were at the restaurant, and it was like 8 o'clock, but it was dark. but 8 o'clock it's like everybody's on the street. I just stepped out of the restaurant, they were talking, and I just stepped out of the restaurant just to look. It was a new country, so I want to look at everything, right? I'm going out and I'm looking everywhere. All of a sudden, the doorman from the restaurant, he came, "What are you doing here?" And I was right on the porch. I was not even outside on the street. And I said, "Nothing, I just want to look at the lights and everything. It's beautiful." So he said, no, I can see you're a tourist. Go back, and you don't know. They didn't tell you, don't come. I'm like, literally on the porch of the restaurant. You were standing here, my crew is inside, and it was a lot of people on the street. He said, "No, you're not supposed to." And he asked me to get back in, and I did. So, and everywhere we had to go, we had to be escorted by a guy of like.
Wait, how long ago was that?
It was 2006.
I feel like, is that like most like a female thing? 'Cause I know my boyfriend would go to surf trips in South Africa and he didn't have
I'm
a
sure it's a
problem.
female thing. Of course, because they told us
Yeah.
to be escorted by male. So
See,
they didn't even
yeah.
talk to. I don't think they talked to the boys.
Yeah, like.
They specifically told us not to do that. So I'm sure that if you were a boy, probably you wouldn't even know. They wouldn't even tell you. Okay, I will leave the Nigeria for Kehinde to cover, and then come on, Ken. Do you have PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Did you send it to me?
No, I have to open it.
Okay, that's fine. And I will cover the rest.